So what we're going to talk about tonight is, of course, first, we're going to talk a little bit about getting started. And then I want to tell you a little bit about some basics to keep your houseplants healthy and happy. And also what might be good, what might go wrong and how to recognize it. And then we're going to close with a few easy to grow houseplants. So, and for your questions, you can kind of get a sense of what we're going to go over. So if it's coming up later, just sit tight and put your questions in at the end. Jot them down as you go along. So first, let's get started. So are you one of those people who cannot walk by a display of houseplants? Is it like the best temptation ever or the worst temptation ever? I'm in the can't go by a display without there being having to stop and look at it. So it's always great to start simple. The plants that you see, for example, at grocery stores and at hardware stores, those kinds of places, usually are fairly easy to grow because they're quick to propagate for the grower. And I think that's, if you're new to houseplants, I think that's a great place to start. And you will learn as you go. And don't be afraid to experiment. And if your plant dies, that's okay because you will have learned something from that. So don't get discouraged. The best way to learn sometimes is learning from things that did not quite work out the way you expected. Like you expected, like my slide's not advancing. Let's see here. So here's a few things. Seasonal plants, they're great for the season. I think right now you're going to start seeing things like little Christmas trees or holiday greenery. So I want to just, these plants all come from someplace, and these seasonal plants are often coming from temperate places, places with seasons. And so just as a word to the wise, this Norfolk Island pine is a very popular plant to grow. It's a very, very beautiful tree, but it gets big. And you can see on the right-hand side, a tree that probably started out small. It's in its pot, and it is all the way up to the ceiling in this picture. And here's another view. The tree in the middle sticking up, that is a Norfolk Island pine. And I thought it would be fun to start with this because if you do get that kind of plant, it's probably a really good idea to look up how big it's going to grow. Because in the case of these holiday trees, you will want to site it thoughtfully because you really don't want to end up with a large tree really close to your house because that might lead to some tree work that needs to be done later. So if you've attended the Master Gardener talks in the past, we always like to start with the 4 foundations of success. These are the 4 critical requirements, and it includes we talk about this with outdoor plants, with landscape plants, but this also includes house plants. How these things pull together is what's considered good cultural care, how you take care of your plants. And I'm going to use these 4 foundations of success as an outline for successfully growing houseplants. So the 4 foundations are soil, water, aeration, and of course, sunlight, or in the case of houseplants, any kind of light, really. So I think to really help you get a really good grasp of the things I'm going to talk about, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about plant biology in 45 seconds. So 2 of the foundations are about soil and air, and I want to relate that to how the roots function. So, of course, roots do anchor the plant. Without the roots, they would fall over. But what the roots do is they absorb the water and nutrients for the plant to grow. And they need energy and, most importantly, oxygen for them to grow. Remember this, roots need oxygen. And the roots rely on the food made by the leaves. And then the stem then is essentially the superhighway to move things around the plants. Now, for the sun and water part of our 4 foundations, The leaves, of course, are the places that make all of the sugars that they're then transformed into things that grow the plants. And it's imperative for the plant to have light, water, and carbon dioxide to be able to function to photosynthesize, as well as good chlorophyll. So sun, water for the leaves, aeration, and soil functions for the roots. So this kind of seems kind of a silly thing to say, but houseplants all come from someplace where they grow outdoors. Generally speaking, they come from the tropics or subtropical areas, and those areas are the closest to household temperatures. Most tropical plants are not comfortable when it gets cold for extended periods of time. They're often understory plants, which means they grow on the floor under the trees, and that translates to being not needing a lot of direct light. And if you read a houseplant book, you might see a lot of plants listed that in our mild Bay area do well outdoors. So really there's kind of this crossover, especially here, about what you can grow indoors and what you can grow outdoors. So of course, the first thing here in the 4 foundations is to talk about the right light. One thing to remember about light is that when it comes in through your window, it loses intensity. The light that's outside your window is much, much stronger than the light that is coming through on your windowsill. When your plant is about 3 feet away from the window, there's going to be a significant loss for the light intensity. And once the plant is about 6 feet away from the window, it really doesn't get much to the plant at all. Now, in terms of exposures, an eastern exposure has the best light and temperature conditions for most indoor plants. It gets really nice morning light, and it doesn't get too hot. Now, for the western and the southern exposures, it's a brighter light, but there's more temperature variation. The southern exposure and the western exposures are pretty interchangeable for most plants. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you are growing variegated plants, you really are going to need to have good light, otherwise you're going to lose the variegation. That really has to have strong light. So here's an example of too little light. This is a streptocarpus, and you'll notice on the left, you might see yellowing leaves, and you also might see elongated nodes. And that is when the plant gets leggy. That's when the leaves, there's more stem between the leaves, they get longer and longer, and that's to help the leaves reach the light. Now, there's sometimes that your room just doesn't get enough light, and there are, if you have the right exposure, there's still some things that can block the light. And one way that here are a few suggestions on how you can have brighter light bring it into your room. One thing is to wash your windows and wash your screens. That will kind of take that layer away and allow more light to come in. And then another thing is to wipe down your plants. That will help them, again, have more surface. It won't be cluttered with pet dander and dust. A really simple way to wash your leaves off is to take 2 damp sponges and very, very gently put the leaf in between and pull it out. That way you can get both the top of the leaf and the bottom of the leaf in the same one fell swoop. Adding mirrors can help with reflecting lights, and rooms that are light colored also are going to reflect light much better. Now, if you have too much light, which is also possible even indoors, is that the plants often can get scorched or bleached leaves. And you can see on the left, you can see that brown leaf really kind of looking crispy. And then on the right, you see that discoloration, which is bleaching. What I didn't mention about this section is, for the purposes of this talk, I'm not going to discuss anything about growing under lights. We're restricting this talk only to growing with the light that comes naturally into your home. So the next foundation is about potting mix, which is soil, the soil part. So potting mix is actually not what's considered soil. It does act like soil. And one of the things to think about or remember with soil, and perhaps you attended one of our previous talks there was one on soil. Soil acts as a sponge. Now, the store-bought potting mix may or may not contain things that will retain water, but they will come with some fertilizer in them. And you might see, for example, these little white balls, that's called perlite, and that is something that's added to potting mixes to help for two reasons. One, it helps with aeration. That, again, is going to make the roots have access to air. And the other thing, which I think is really curious, is that it both helps with the drainage of the water, but it also will hold the water as well. And it is a mineral component of the soil. So, and for garden soil sometimes can have pathogens. It's really heavy, and so the potting mix that is designed for container growing is what you want to use. Now, I just wanted to give some examples of a potting mix. And then I turned it over on the back, and you may not be able to actually read all of the words, but what this tells you is what the components are. The component that has the most is the first component, and then it goes down smaller and smaller and smaller. And on this mix, it also tells you what the fertilizer is. And so you can get a really, really good sense of what's in your potting mix and what kind of fertilizer it might have to get you started. When you first bring your plant home, it's going to not need fertilizer. It's been fertilized at the nursery before it comes. There may be a slow release fertilizer as part of the potting mix. And those are enough nutrients really to keep your plant happy for about 2 to 3 months. When it does come time to fertilizer, you need to read the label. And that's something that you're going to hear a few times through this talk. Read the label. The secret to fertilizing indoor plants is to apply small amounts of fertilizer as the plants grow. Without new growth, the plant has a limited need for new water. It's much, much better to under-fertilize than over-fertilize. Now, here are a few tips. There are all kinds of fertilizers. There are some that are designed for particular plants. You may see African violet fertilizer, orchid fertilizer. We're not going to cover orchids in this talk either. But again, read the label. Generally, these houseplant formulations contain a lower percentage of the mineral elements to help prevent over-fertilization. So again, read the label. If the label says this much for a monthly fertilization, you can also cut that in half. Use half that rate and apply it every 2 weeks. So that's another way that you can do the fertilizer. Again, you want to have it go slowly and match the rate of growth with the plants. If you are going to fertilize once a month, you might want to consider putting it on your calendar so you don't forget. I know we sometimes get questions about whether or not you can use worm castings with houseplants. Worm castings have lots of great nutrients in them. So yes, you can use a little bit of vermicompost in your mix, but you don't want to use more than 25%. That is the maximum by volume. So, consider that in your houseplant growing. And you can also use it as a top dressing, which is to put a very, very thin layer around on the top of your soil. So next, aeration. And I'm going to add into the aeration air. And you'll find out in a minute why. So it's really, really important for there to be air in the soil. And this diagram shows you the round balls. The brown balls, of course, are different kinds of the different components of the soil, the solid components. But notice the blue. The blue's the water. The white is the air. So you have both air and water. And notice how the water tends to go down to the bottom of the pot. Perlite, again, really helps with lightening up the potting mix. And it will really help with the compaction of the soil because you do not want to have your soil get smushed. Now, something that you may not consider, or maybe you do, is the relative humidity. Thinking again about tropics and subtropical areas, the humidity is fairly high and it's there most of the, pretty consistently. Now, the air in houses tends to be very dry. However, and plants need moisture to be able to photosynthesize. And if the air is too dry, it can really kind of slow down the growth of the plants. So, I'm going to talk about how some ways that you can raise the humidity around your plants. And that would include doing things like this. If you group your plants together, this picture shows you a group of plants, and what they're sitting on is a tray of pebbles. And that tray of pebbles has some water in it. The water does not go up high enough to touch the bottoms of the pots, but it's a very shallow layer. And then the water will evaporate and help increase the humidity. And then also the plants being together helps with creating a humid environment. So here's one on a pebble tray, but you can just, again, group your plants together and make kind of a nice composition with them. What you might not think about in terms of air in your home is that the air, for the most part, doesn't move very much. And if you think about plants outside, the air is moving a lot, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly. And this air movement is really, really important to plant growth. It helps with strengthening the stems and branches. And the other thing that's interesting about air movement is pests tend to not like plants that are moving around. So this is something to think about. You don't ever want to put your plants too close to an air conditioning vent or too close to a heating vent. Of course, the air is moving there, but that cold air and that warm air would contribute to drying out the plants. One thing that you can do with your plants is plants like to go on vacation. And you can take your plants outside in the summer. You would want to put them in a sheltered place under an overhang or on a shadier part of your house, because they're coming from inside the house where there's not as much light to going outside, but they get more air, and that really can help with keeping them happy. Now, here's an example of a ZZ plant. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. And you can see that the plant is kind of weak, and that has to do with there was not enough air circulation. So again, it does really surprisingly affect the way the plant responds to your environment. Now, water. This is a balancing act, right? You don't want too much, you don't want too little. And so here's a little video of showing two plants, and one is sitting without getting watered, and the other one is sitting in a tray of water. And so here we go. So you can see the leaves moving and responding to light, but look oops, there it goes. So it's pretty interesting. The plant that was overly dry, it kind of held on for a little while, and then it totally collapsed. And I'm going to play it again for you. So there you have it. Now, In terms of the quality of the water, most of our local water companies, I know that EBMUD has really, really high quality water for watering your houseplants. You can check with your water company about what the mineral content, et cetera, is in your water. If you live someplace where you're on a well, you will want to have your water tested. I know that out in, towards Discovery Bay, there's a lot of boron in the water, and boron is not really very good for the plants. So, and another thing to remember again is that these plants are coming from subtropical areas, tropical areas where it's kind of, a nice warmish temperature. And the plants are best watered with tepid water. You don't want to put freezing cold water on your plants. At this time of the year, I know at my house that when I turn the faucet on, initially the water that comes out is really, really cold. So room temperature water is great, or just let the water get a little bit warm, and that will, again, keep your plants happy. If you get the water's too cold, you can get cold damage on your leaves, which is a little bit of browning. Now, when do you want to water? You want to water, of course, when it's dry, but there are a lot of factors that affect how much water you give a plant. One of the things, of course, is the plant size. A larger plant, this seems obvious, right? A larger plant's going to need more water compared to smaller plants. You also need to take into consideration the volume of the container. If the growing container is small, you may need to water more frequently. And again, think about the soil and think about the airspace in the water. The plant's going to use it more quickly because there's less of it available. The soil moisture, if you already have water present in the plant, you want, or in the soil, you want to test it by touching it to see what, to get a sense of the frequency. The light intensity as well. If the plants that are in brighter light are going to use more water. So these are a few things to consider about when to water. You don't want to set a schedule. You want to water when the plants need water. So how do you water your plants is the next thing. When you water your plants, you need to have the water run all the way through the pot and come out the drainage hole. That will get the soil to hold the right amount of water and the right amount of air for the plants. A lot of times for houseplants, they're put in decorative sleeves or catch pots that don't have a hole at the bottom. So when you water, you really want to pick up your plant, take it out of that cache pot, and if you and check to make sure the water's run all the way through. If you do water with the plant in the cache pot, it's really a good idea to pick the plant up and check that there's no water in the bottom of that container, because plants sitting in water are really, really unhappy. The other issue with sitting in water is that when you start fertilizing your plants, it can be the fertilizer, if it sits in the bottom of the pot, if it sits in the water, it can result in over-fertilization, and over-fertilization can damage the plant roots. And when the plant roots are damaged, the plant cannot grow as well, because of course the plant roots are what's taking up the water and the nutrients to get the plant moving. So again, it's really important to discard the water that may collect in those pots. Another trick in terms of knowing when to water is you can pick up your pot when it's well watered, when it's perfect. Pick it up to get a sense of how it feels. How much does it weigh? If you pick it up and it's really light, probably it's time to water. So next is container gardening, because for the most part, houseplants are grown in containers. Sometimes you'll see them grown in atriums, but again, we're going to focus on container growing for this talk. So container gardening, there are all kinds of pots. There are clay pots that are unglazed. There are glazed pots. There are plastic pots. The glazed pots tend not to leak water. The unglazed terracotta pots, the water can seep out. Note that the sleeves, again, often don't have drainage holes, but it's really important, again, to check for your water. And you really need to check because about whether the water is going to seep out of the bottom of the pots, even if they're glazed. If you turn the pot over, sometimes you'll see the bottom isn't glazed. So you would, I think you should really consider putting it on some kind of protective coaster, or if you don't want to do that, put it on a piece of cardboard to start and leave it there for a few days to see if the water seeps out, because the last thing you want to have is a big watermark on your favorite piece of furniture or on your piano. Hanging baskets. Hanging baskets for watering are going to need more water because, again, there's more air around the pot and they're losing water that way. But you really also need to watch out for the dripping. And again, the pots that are hanging are going to dry out more quickly than other plants. So again, I mentioned about furniture protection. There are all kinds of ways you can protect your furniture. You can, of course, use saucers. You can use plates. There are cork mats that you can use. In a pinch, you can use a yogurt or a cottage cheese container that will fit the size of the pot. And if it's too tall, just get your scissors out and cut it down to the right height. And if you're really, really strapped, you can even use some aluminum foil, again, to help slow down the water so it doesn't go into your furniture or into that pot and then through the bottom. So here's a little story about a decorative sleeve. This sleeve actually was the sleeve that came on the plants that were in what I call the sacrificial house plant that was in the video. This is a ceramic sleeve. Notice that it has a nice saucer. It has a drainage hole. So you would think you would be all set, right? You have the hole, the saucer. You just don't have to worry about the water. It can go through. You have the saucer to protect your to collect the water at the bottom. But look at this. I filled this container with the hole and with the saucer with water. It's up to the blue line. I know in the photograph it's a little hard to see. And after 24 hours, the water hadn't gone through this pot. And that's because even though it had a hole in it and it had that saucer, it was designed not to leak. So this was, I think, a clever thing on the part of the manufacturer, but check your pots because you might get something tricky like this one. So things go wrong with your plants. No matter, somewhere along the line, something's going to go wrong with your plants. So I want to do a little troubleshooting here. Your home environment is really important. Probably the number one cause of houseplant death is overwatering. You really need to pay attention to them. You really need to nurture them. You need to watch for pests. And it's important to have really good cultural practices, which extends to keeping things clean and watching, as I said, watching out for pests. So you need to get to know your plant's likes and dislikes. They will tell you. Study them, get to know them, and get to know their needs and how the best locations in your home. If you have a plant that isn't looking so good, it may need to be someplace else in more light or in less light. You should select plants that have the same growing requirements as where you're going to put them, especially the light and the temperature. So again, understanding what the plant needs and then recreating that as best you can is going to really help you be successful with the growing of your plants. Also, plants that are healthy are less vulnerable to attack by pests and diseases. When they're healthy, they have better immune response, if you want to kind of put it in terms of a human body. So here are a few things that can go wrong. Leaves dropping. There are a number of things that can cause leaf drop. Too much water. it can be too dry. Root diseases will cause the leaves to drop because, again, the roots can't get the things up to the leaves, and then the leaves can't process, and the plant doesn't need them anymore, and so they drop them. Too much fertilizer or salts, and that's not table salts. The fertilizers for houseplants are what's called salt-based fertilizers. If the soil is compacted or the plant is root bound, that can also lead to leaf drop for the same reason as the overwatering, because there's not going to be as much air and water available if the soil is really, really compacted, or if the pot has so many roots in it that it's really, really tight in there. Another thing that plants can be sensitive to is changes in light and temperature. And that's called acclimatization, getting used to the new place. A plant that is famous or notorious, depending on your point of view, for dropping leaves when you move it 1 inch to the right or a foot to the left or into the next room is Ficus benjamina, the weeping figs. These plants almost always drop their leaves, either a few of them or all of them, when they are relocated. And is that something to be worried about? No. It's just that the plant is getting used to the new light situation, and then it will put out new leaves. So if that happens, you are still in good shape and you are still a good gardener. Another thing you might see is weak growth or the leaves being light colored. There might be a nutrient deficiency, and nitrogen is the nutrient that's most concerned with the green in the leaves. Again, root rot. Why is this? Because the materials cannot get up to the leaves. You can also have too much light or too little light. That can also lead to weak growth or having the leaves turn yellow. And then sap-sucking insects and mites can also discolor the leaves because they're kind of taking all of the good stuff out of the leaves. So here's a dumb cane, a Dieffenbachia, and you can see at the bottom that yellow leaf. So let's go on to the next one. Long stems or internodes. This is not enough light. This is, as I mentioned earlier, this is the plant trying to reach towards the light as best it can. When this happens, depending on your plant, sometimes you can cut it back down, leave it, a couple inches, and it will resprout and give you some fresh new growth. Wilting. This is something that can go from underwatering, but wilting can also be caused by overwatering. Poor drainage and root disease. So the underwatering is obvious, right? And you saw in the video, the plant just like, overwatering, again, is taking that soil and having it completely saturated with water. And there's no oxygen, so the plant can't get the things up from the soil. And then poor drainage, of course, and root disease. These are all things that relate to the roots. And roots are something that often we don't think about because they're not visible. So when you have a plant that is wilting, it's really, really important to figure out why it's wilting. Often you see a plant that's wilting and your first response is it needs water. So you get your watering can and then you put some water on it. And then a few days later you look at it and it's still wilting, and then you put some more water on it. And then you think, oh no, maybe I should check it. And you pull it up and it's sitting in 2 inches of water. So don't immediately go to wilting is caused by underwatering. Sometimes you'll have just a few yellowing leaves, not enough fertilizer. It might be pot bound. Again, you're kind of seeing a pattern here. Each of these went wrong things can have many, many causes. Again, poor drainage, overwatering, yellowing leaves with not enough light, and pests, again, sucking all of the delicious pest goodness out of the leaves. if you have most of the leaves yellowing, it can be too much light. That's that the leaves are getting scorched. Water, too much or too little. High temperatures, when it gets warm, especially when you have warm and dry together, that can lead to yellowing leaves and insects. If you're seeing yellowing leaves on your newer growth, it's most likely from overwatering. Sometimes you'll see the tips of the leaves will get brown, or the margin, which is the edge of the leaves, will get brown. And you can see in this picture, there's a little bit of brown on the edge of the leaf on the left-hand side. Overwatering is a cause of brown margins. If the soil gets dry, it can also, the margins can drop, can turn brown, and too much fertilizer also is something that can cause these brown tips. Low humidity as well. And low humidity also can be associated with a drafty setting. Root rot. This is something, of course, you would need to pull your plant out and look at it, but root rot can be caused by overwatering. There are some diseases that affect roots. Too much fertilizer or water that has it has too much salt in it. And then compacted soil or poorly drained containers. Again, these are all things that contribute to the roots not being able to get enough air. They're sitting in water, and then they just, they rot, and then your plant declines because it can't get what it needs. Pests. Plants get pests. And how did they get there? The pests don't just sort of spontaneously happen. If you get houseplant pests, it's probably because you've brought in a plant that had some little critters on it. So when you buy a new plant, it's really good to examine them well, look under the leaves, look on top of the leaves for insects. You might also want to look at the base of the leaves, the fruits, the flowers and the flower stalks, and the roots if possible. It is okay to pull the plant gently out of the container and take a look at the roots. When you bring a new plant home, the best practice is to isolate it away from your other plants. And the reason for this is that many of these plant pests in their early stages are really, really, really small, and you may not notice them. And then as the pests develop, then you'll see them. And if the plants are close together, the pests can go from plant to plant. So again, a good thing is to isolate the plants. Of course, finding things early is always the best. And then when you see these things, sometimes all it takes is a little bit of water. In terms of doing a more targeted thing, you really need to understand what the pest is. And then sometimes if your plant is really heavily infested with pests, probably the better part of valor is to discard it. It's so once things really get a strong foothold, it's very, very difficult to get rid of them and then get the plant to regrow and return to good health. There are all kinds of things that you can do. You always want to start with the very, very lightest touch. As I mentioned, just plain water can be a great place to start. Just, spray things down. And when you do go to other controls, like the fertilizer, it's really, really important to read the label. Probably another kind of soft touch for pest control is to use an insecticidal soap. Insecticidal soap is not the same as dish soap. The insecticidal soap is formulated to not damage the leaves. The dish soap that you get to wash your dishes. Every company has its own secret formulation. And so you don't know how it may damage the leaves. It may be too strong or have things in it that are damaging. So best practice is to use insecticidal soap. And again, read the label, because the label will tell you what it targets. So on any pesticide, whether it's insecticidal soap or something stronger, there is a little packet, there's a little booklet there. And in the store, it's often covered with a little piece of like plastic wrap, just so it doesn't flop around. It is absolutely fine for you to take that off and read the label. Read that little booklet. The booklet will tell you many, many things, and among them, it will tell you what pests it will kill. The first thing you need to know, of course, is what you have. And then when you look, for example, at this insecticidal soap, you need to see that this will target that pest. Otherwise, you're just sort of spraying things willy-nilly and just, it's ineffective. So here are a few of the most common pests that you may see on your houseplants. One of them is mealybugs. They're these little oval sap-sucking insects, and they have kind of this cottony, powdery stuff on them. They like to be along the veins of the leaves, along where the leaves join the leaf stalks join the stem. And symptoms of this can be stunted plant growth. The leaves can yellow. You might see leaves wilting. You need to check really, really carefully for mealybugs. Once they get out of control, they're just about, you can't really manage them. So it's really good to catch them early. You can scrape them off. You can wash them off. You can also use a cotton swab and some isopropyl alcohol and dab them. That will get rid of them. Once you do that, and if the weather is nice, if you put the plants outside, that will also help kind of get the pests unhappy and have them kind of go away. Another pest that you might see is scale. And scale are these brownish grayish, they're mostly stationary insects, and they have a very waxy shell-like body that goes over the insect itself. These are really difficult to get rid of. You can scrape them off. You can just kind of knock them off with your fingernail. When this scale in its juvenile phase does move, it has little crawlers, and you can, when they're in the crawling stage, target them. Once they get to they make these little shells, they're really, really hard to get rid of. And when you have stems that start looking like this, you probably just want to pitch your plant and get something new. Spider mites are something that they're teeny tiny, and they're spiders. They're not insects, the mites. And they can affect several kinds of indoor plants, and they can cause severe injury. What they do is they suck on the bottom of the leaves, and then you get these stippled looking leaves. You'll see all of these white spots. Spider mites love low humidity and dusty conditions. So by helping, keep the humidity around the plants up a little bit and keep the dust away, that can help reduce the likelihood of spider mites. This kind of pest is really, you can wash it with just water, and that can go a long ways to getting rid of it. And then again, if you do choose to use a pesticide, be sure to read the label to make sure that it's effective on whatever you're trying to treat. For example, this case, spider mites, and read what it says. And get something that is labeled for indoors use, because it tends to be less, it's not as strong as what you use for outdoor plants. And again, I've said this 10 times, but read the directions and follow them. And then the last thing is fungus gnats. These are teeny tiny little things. They They fly around. The gnats themselves don't really do too much, but what they do is they lay eggs in the soil. And the larvae from the gnats then like to eat the roots in the soil. Fungus gnats really like moist organic soil. And one way to get rid of them is to let the soil let the soil dry out a little bit. You want to remove old plant material that will help reduce the amount of organic matter available. Good air circulation can also discourage fungus gnats. For their control, you can also use yellow sticky traps. And one thing also to be aware of is that bags of potting soil can bring in the fungus gnats. And so from UC Integrated Pest Management, we really recommend that you make sure that your potting mix is pasteurized. So here's a little game of what's the truth. Myth versus fact. This is now about watering. Keep a watering routine. You know, it's Monday, it's the day I water my plants. That's a myth. What you really want to do is you want to water when your plant needs it. You want to check. Use your finger. Your finger is not going to lie. Test the soil. If it's dry on the top, see if it's, the dry at the inch. Every plant has different watering needs. And of course, there are watering meters. There are variable results. They run the gamut of being really inexpensive to being really very, very expensive. Your fingers are really, really great tool, so don't be afraid to use it. And you can always wash it off with soap and water when you're done. Here's another one. You should just water the top of the soil. Oh, it just needs a little bit of water. No, what you want to do is you want to water until some of the water drains out of the pot. And not only does that, ensure that there's going to still be air in the soil, but it also makes sure that any fertilizer that's accumulated can be leached out, and then always discard the water that may accumulate in the saucers. Here's another one. Oh, I have a little plant and I'm going to put it in a really big pot because then it's going to grow big and strong. Actually, what you want to do is you want to use a pot that's the right size for the plant. When you have too much soil, the roots there's more water in a bigger pot available, and that can drown the roots of a smaller plant. So when you repot, you want to only go up one size, and what one size is 2 inches. So if you're in an inch on either side of the pot. So if you're in a 4-inch pot, the next size up is a 6-inch pot, etc. So that's pretty easy to determine. Oh, here's another one. Layering different potting mixes. I have a little bit of this, I have a little bit of that. I'll just use it up. When you do this, it really affects how the water moves through the soil, and that's not good. So if you do need to use a few different kinds of potting mix, put it in a tub, mix it up so it's all the same, and then you can use that. Now, the biggest myth of all is about adding gravel to the bottom of the pot. This is really not something you want to do. What happens is that when the water goes through the soil, it stops when it gets to the gravel. And you can see this on the right-hand side. It's just sort of getting there. So there's a saturated zone. And of course, with a saturated zone, there's going to be no oxygen for the roots. So a layer of gravel is damaging. If you think about having soil acts like a sponge. So if you have a damp sponge and you put it on some gravel, does that affect how fast the water moves through the sponge? It doesn't. No. So how do you deal with the hole in the bottom of the pot? You can cover it with a coffee filter. You can use fine netting. Drywall tape is another option. So I want to finish up with some easy houseplants for you. Selecting new plants. Of course, you want to bring home a healthy plant. You want to, again, select a plant that you have the right conditions for. You want to make sure that it's something that you have the time and ability to take care of. Some plants don't need much care. Some plants need a little bit more attention. You often will see flowering plants like amaryllis and chrysanthemums, azaleas. Those kinds of plants are really best treated as cut flowers. They're happiest outside. And again, don't be afraid to take the plant out of the pot and check its roots to make sure the roots are in good shape. So here's an easy plant. It's the ZZ plant. It's super tolerant of low light. It's super tolerant of forgetful watering. It's something that you can put in a dark corner. And the little story of ZZ is in the Master Gardener help desk. When we were still in the office, it's working remotely. And right now, it was an interior office and the lights were on motion sensors. The help desk office was only staffed a few hours a week. I don't know, it was about 12 or so. And of course, during the day, people walk through it. But the main thing is that most of the time, the lights were not on in that room. And yet, ZZ, we call this plant, and this is ZZ. ZZ continued to grow and added a little bit of, made people happy, because that's another thing about growing houseplants, right? Is that they make you happy and you can make them happy. Here's a good plant for medium light. It's the parlor palm or the Neanthophylla Chamaedorea elegans. This is something that would be suitable for an east-facing window or located near, not right close, but near a west-facing window. This will also tolerate low light, and it's also good with just kind of average temperatures. It can get to be about 4 feet tall. I saw one at the grocery store that was about 3 inches tall, so it does grow. This snake plant is another great plant for high light. It has those thick leaves, so even though high light areas are going to be warm and make plants dry out faster, these plants with thicker leaves are able to tolerate it. You need to really let the soil dry out before you water them. This is something that's going to be really, really sensitive. Make sure at least the top inch is dry. So check that with your finger. Succulents are really, really fun. They're super popular. I think we're seeing them a lot outside. They're also something that you can grow indoors. They're easy. They don't require much care. They do need plenty of light and well-draining soil. So again, like the snake plant in the previous slide, you want to make sure the soil has dried out a little bit. And once the plants get crowded in the pot, for example, in this echeveria, it makes all those rosettes. You can divide them and separate them, and you'll have more for your garden or more to share with your friends. The golden pothos is a plant that is super tolerant. It can take all kinds of light levels. It can be considered an indicator plant. It often will show signs of wilting before other plants. So if you see your pothos wilting a little bit, you might want to go around and check your other plants. It likes best bright but indirect light, but it will adapt to lower light and medium light. When the light levels are lower, of course, that's going to slow the growth because there's not as much light for the plants to be able to get to photosynthesize. So it slows down its growth. Tall plants, if you want a floor plant, the dragon plant, Dracaena marginata, is another great choice. It's really easy. It does grow best in a well-lit space. It doesn't like being in low light. It doesn't like being in direct sunlight, but it's good. It's tolerant. And it has a really pretty, it's called a marginata because it's a really pretty red edge to these narrow leaves. And here are a few more easy house plants. The inch plant, spider plants. These are plants that can tolerate a large range of environmental conditions. The Monstera, the Swiss cheese vine, is something else that is very tolerant. And the peace lily, spathiphyllum, again, that's a lower light plant, but it's super tolerant of all many things. Except doesn't like super bright light, but it can tolerate low to medium light and a kind of a range of watering. So, in conclusion, I want to talk about, again, going back to these 4 foundations and how they work together. The light, the soil, the air, the water, they all need to fit together like this puzzle piece. This puzzle, you need to understand them for successful gardening. Light, affects the temperature. The soil affects the ability for the plant to absorb water. So if you can kind of grasp these concepts about these different components and also about the importance of the roots, you will be well on your way to having healthy, happy houseplants, making you a healthy, happy gardener. So thank you.